The chair didn't just tip, it cracked against marble like something breaking that couldn't be fixed. Emily Carter's breath caught halfway in her chest as the world tilted, the sharp scrape of wood against polished floor echoing across the ballroom, and for one suspended second, just one, every crystal glass, every whispered conversation, every measured step in that 50-story luxury gala seemed to freeze around her falling body. Then came the silence, heavy and suffocating. The kind that presses against your ears until your own heartbeat sounds too loud to be real, and Emily hit the ground not hard, not violently, but wrong, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach as her chair lay twisted beside her like an accusation no one wanted to acknowledge. Someone gasped soft, almost polite, the way people react when something inconvenient happens in a room designed for perfection, and from somewhere above her a woman's voice, smooth, composed, untouched, said, "Oh my God, she's so clumsy." And that was Vanessa Blake, standing tall in a fitted black dress that caught the light just right. Her posture flawless, her expression barely disturbed, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a minor disruption in an otherwise perfect evening. Emily didn't look at her, couldn't, her focus narrowing to the faint rhythm beneath her palm, the quiet reassurance that her baby was still there, still moving, still holding on, and then she heard it. The sound that would later be replayed millions of times, dissected, debated, turned into headlines and hashtags, the low, amused chuckle of Daniel Carter, her husband, the man who had once held her hand through sleepless nights and whispered promises that felt unbreakable, now standing just a few feet away with a glass of bourbon in his hand, watching her on the floor as if she were a stranger who had simply embarrassed herself in public. "Emily," he said, not with concern, not with urgency, but with a kind of detached irritation. "You're making a scene." And a ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, over 200. Guests dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns shifting just enough to show they had noticed, but not enough to involve themselves, because this was how these rooms worked. Problems were observed, not touched, witnessed, not interrupted. Somewhere to her left, a phone slipped from her hand unnoticed, its screen still lit, its camera still recording, capturing everything from a low, unforgiving angle, the marble floor cold beneath her cheek, the hem of Vanessa's dress inches from her line of sight, the polished shoes of men who stepped back rather than forward, and above all, Daniel's face, relaxed, almost entertained, as if this moment belonged to someone else's story, not his. "She's pregnant," a voice whispered, barely audible, and yet it moved through the room like a quiet current, changing something intangible in the air, a shift too small to stop what had already happened but large enough to make it impossible to ignore completely, and still, no one bent down, no one reached out, no one said the one thing that should have been said, because acknowledging it would mean choosing a side, and in rooms like this, neutrality was the most expensive luxury of all. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against her dress, her breathing slow, deliberate, controlled in a way that didn't match the chaos unfolding around her, and for a moment, just a flicker, her eyes lifted, not toward Daniel, not toward Vanessa, but toward the ceiling lights reflecting off glass and gold and polished stone, as if she were measuring something far bigger than the fall itself, something that hadn't even fully revealed itself yet, and somewhere in the background, almost lost beneath the hum of air conditioning and distant music, the faintest sound of a notification echoed from her fallen phone, unheard by most. But not unimportant, not this time. The notification sound was small, almost delicate, but it cut through the stillness like a thread being pulled tight, and on the floor beside Emily Carter, the screen of her phone flickered once, then again, its lens still pointed upward, still watching, still remembering everything that the room was trying so hard to ignore. A waiter standing near the back of the ballroom noticed it first, not because he was looking for trouble, but because in a place where everything was controlled, anything out of place demanded attention, and a phone lying unattended on polished marble, recording, glowing softly beneath crystal light, was not something that belonged. He hesitated, just for a second, his training telling him to remain invisible, to never interfere with guests, to move quietly between moments rather than step into them. But then his eyes shifted to Emily, still on the floor, her hands steady against her stomach, her breathing measured in a way that felt intentional, Not weak, not broken, just controlled, as if she understood something no one else in the room had caught yet. Daniel, Vanessa said lightly, her tone almost playful now. You might want to help her up before people start getting the wrong idea. And a few guests let out nervous laughter, the kind that exists only to fill silence, to smooth over discomfort without actually addressing it, and Daniel took a slow sip of his drink before responding, his voice calm. Dismissive. If she needs help, she will ask for it. As if dignity were something that could be negotiated in public, as if concern were optional when it became inconvenient. Across the room, a man in a gray suit leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made her eyes widen, her gaze flicking from Emily to Vanessa to Daniel and then quickly away, because looking too long meant involvement, and involvement meant risk. Meanwhile, the waiter had moved closer. Each step careful. Deliberate, his focus no longer on service but on something else entirely, something that felt heavier than the rules he had been taught, and when he reached the phone, he did not pick it up immediately. He simply looked at the screen, at the live recording, at the small red icon blinking in the corner, confirming what he already suspected. This moment was not just happening, it was being captured, preserved. Turned into something that could not be rewritten later. Emily's voice came then, soft. But clear, not directed at anyone in particular, yet impossible to ignore once spoken. I am okay, she said, though her body remained still, though she made no attempt to stand. And there was something in the way she said it that shifted the energy again, not a plea, not a defense, but a statement, as if she were placing a marker in time, defining the moment before anyone else could distort it. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, studying her, a faint smile playing at her lips. You always say that, she replied, her tone carrying a familiarity that felt rehearsed, practiced, as if this dynamic had played out before in quieter, less public spaces. And Daniel's expression did not change, but his eyes flickered briefly toward the phone on the floor, then back to his glass, then away again, as if he had already decided it. Did not matter. What he did not see, what no one in that immediate circle noticed, was the waiter reaching into his pocket, pulling out his own phone, and tapping a single number, his voice low, controlled, professional in a way that did not match the tension around him. Yes, I need someone to come up to the main ballroom, he said quietly, turning slightly so his words would not carry. There has been an incident. And as he ended the call, the first phone, the one still recording on the floor, gave another soft notification, this time followed by a subtle change on the screen, a small icon appearing that indicated something had just been sent, uploaded, secured somewhere beyond the reach of anyone standing in that room. Emily's fingers relaxed slightly against her dress, her eyes closing for just a fraction of a second, and when they opened again, there was no panic there, no fear. Only a quiet certainty that made no sense to those watching but would soon make sense to everyone else. And in the distance, far below the polished marble and golden light, the faint echo of an elevator arriving on the floor began to hum, unnoticed, inevitable. The soft hum of the elevator grew louder, subtle at first, then unmistakable, a mechanical arrival that did not belong to the curated rhythm of champagne glasses and polite conversation, and one by one, a few heads in the far corner of the ballroom began to turn, not out of curiosity, but instinct, the kind that senses a shift before it fully reveals itself. Emily Carter remained on the floor, her breathing steady, her hands still resting protectively over her stomach, and though she had not moved, something about her presence had changed, as if the stillness itself had become a form of control, a quiet refusal to rush, to react, to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her unsettled. Daniel Carter noticed the movement near the entrance then, his gaze narrowing slightly as the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and for the first time that evening, the faintest crease appeared between his brows, not concern. Not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when something is no longer entirely within reach. Vanessa Blake followed his line of sight, her expression shifting just enough to register curiosity, though the small smile on her lips remained practiced and composed, as if she believed whatever was coming could be managed, redirected, contained like everything else had been. Across the room, the waiter who had made the call stepped back into the shadows, his role returning to invisibility, but his eyes remained fixed on the entrance, watching as two uniformed officers stepped into the ballroom, their presence immediately altering the atmosphere without a single word spoken. Because authority does not need to announce itself when it arrives in silence. A murmur spread quickly now, no longer contained, no longer polite, voices overlapping in hushed tones that carried just enough weight to fracture the illusion of control that had held the room together moments before, and several guests instinctively reached for their phones, not to intervene, but to capture, to document, to become witnesses in a way that felt safer than participation. Daniel straightened slightly, setting his glass down with deliberate care, his posture shifting into something more formal, more calculated, the version of himself that handled boardrooms and negotiations, not personal matters, not scenes like this. And when one of the officers began walking directly toward him, that crease between his brows deepened into something sharper, something closer to realization. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice measured, controlled, projecting calm in a way that had worked for him in countless situations before. But this time, the question seemed to hang unanswered for a fraction too long, as if the room itself was deciding whether to believe him. Emily's phone, still resting on the marble floor, emitted another faint sound, a confirmation tone so quiet it was nearly lost beneath the growing tension, yet its significance stretched far beyond the room, beyond the building, beyond the moment, because somewhere else, on a screen far removed from polished floors and curated appearances, the same scene was now playing in real time. Unfiltered, undeniable, Vanessa took a small step closer to Daniel, her voice lower now, edged with something that had not been there before. "Just handle it," she murmured, as if this were an inconvenience, a delay in an otherwise perfect evening, and Daniel gave the slightest nod, the kind of gesture that had always been enough to resolve issues, to smooth over complications, to remind people of who he was and what he controlled. But as the officer stopped just a few feet away, their attention not on the room, not on the guests, but directly on Vanessa, that control began to shift in a way that no one could ignore, and for the first time, the balance of power in the room tilted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, like a chair that had already fallen and could not be set upright again. Emily's eyes moved then, slowly, deliberately, lifting from the marble floor to the figure standing before her. And though she said nothing, the quiet certainty in her gaze carried more weight than anything spoken, because this moment, this unfolding, had already been set in motion long before anyone else realized it, and now it was simply arriving. The air shifted the moment the officer spoke her name, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that cut through every whispered conversation and every carefully maintained illusion in the room. "Vanessa Blake," he said, his tone even, professional, leaving no space for interpretation, and for a fraction of a second, the confidence on Vanessa's face held, as if she were deciding whether this was real or simply another situation she could redirect with a smile and the right words. Daniel stepped forward slightly, positioning himself just enough to suggest control without appearing confrontational, the practiced movement of a man used to negotiating outcomes before they fully formed. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm, measured, the same tone that had closed multimillion-dollar deals and silenced opposition in boardrooms across the country. But the officer did not respond immediately, and that pause, that deliberate absence of reaction, carried more weight than any argument Daniel could have made. Across the ballroom, the murmur grew into something sharper now, less contained, less willing to stay quiet, as guests leaned closer to one another, phones subtly raised, lenses angled just enough to capture without drawing attention, because the story unfolding in front of them had shifted from discomfort to something undeniable, something that demanded to be seen. Emily Carter remained where she was, still grounded against the marble, but no longer overlooked, no longer invisible, and as one of the officers glanced briefly in her direction, there was a subtle acknowledgement there, a recognition that placed her not as a disruption, but as the center of what had brought them there. Vanessa let out a small, controlled laugh, the kind designed to dissolve tension, to reframe the moment into something trivial. "Officer, I think you have the wrong person," she said, her tone smooth, confident, but just beneath it, something had changed, something less certain, less anchored than before, and the officer's response came without hesitation this time. "We are responding to a report regarding an incident that occurred here tonight," he said, his gaze steady, unwavering. "And we have video evidence." And those last 3 words moved through the room like a quiet shockwave, subtle but unmistakable, because evidence meant permanence, meant this moment was no longer confined to perception or opinion, it existed somewhere beyond denial. Daniel's eyes flicked again, almost involuntarily, toward the floor where Emily's phone had been. But it was no longer there, the waiter having discreetly moved it out of sight, securing it in a way that removed it from the immediate chaos while ensuring its importance remained intact, and that absence, that small missing detail, created a gap in Daniel's understanding that he could not immediately fill. "This is unnecessary," Daniel said, a slight edge entering his voice now, not anger, not yet, but pressure, the kind that builds when control begins to slip. "We can resolve whatever this is privately." And for a moment, it seemed as if the room itself leaned in, waiting to see if that familiar strategy would work again, if influence and confidence could reshape what was happening into something manageable. But the officer did not shift, did not soften, did not acknowledge the suggestion at all, and instead, his focus returned to Vanessa, his voice steady. "Ma'am, we are going to need you to come with us." And this time, there was no room for interpretation, no space for negotiation, only a clear direction that stood in direct contrast to everything Vanessa had relied on until this moment. The faint glow of screens around the room reflected in polished surfaces, capturing expressions, reactions, the subtle unraveling of composure, and somewhere beyond the walls of the ballroom, the same scene continued to spread, frame by frame, reaching eyes that had never stepped into this world but would soon judge it all the same. Emily's gaze remained steady, her expression calm in a way that did not match the tension around her, and as she slowly began to shift, not to rise quickly, not to react dramatically, but simply to move on her own terms, it became clear that the moment everyone thought had defined her was no longer hers to carry. It had already moved on, already changed shape, already begun to belong to something much larger than the fall itself. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire room was waiting for Vanessa Blake to correct the situation the way she always had, with confidence, with charm, with the kind of effortless control that had carried her through every room like this before. But that moment stretched too long, and in that silence, something fragile began to crack. Vanessa's smile faltered just slightly, not enough for denial, but enough for doubt. Her eyes shifting between the officer and Daniel as if searching for the cue that would reset everything, and when it did not come, her voice lowered tighter now. "This is ridiculous," she said, but the words no longer filled the space the way they had minutes earlier. They fell short, landing somewhere between protest and realization. Daniel stepped closer, his presence firmer this time, no longer casual, no longer detached. "Officer, I think you need to understand who you are speaking to," he said, the edge in his tone no longer hidden, but even as he spoke, there was something in the room that did not respond to him the way it once would have, something that had already shifted beyond his reach. The officer's expression did not change, not even slightly. "Sir, I understand exactly what I am doing," he replied, calm, precise, and the certainty in his voice did not rise, did not push, it simply existed, immovable, and that was what made it different. Across the ballroom, the glow of screens had multiplied, guests no longer pretending not to watch. Their attention fully captured now, the story unfolding in real time, and somewhere beyond them, beyond the glass walls and the skyline stretching for miles, the same images were beginning to spread, shared, replayed, examined from angles that no one in the room could control. Emily Carter shifted again, slowly, carefully, her movements deliberate, not rushed. And as she adjusted herself upright with the help of the edge of a nearby table, a quiet hush followed, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition, because the woman who had been on the floor moments ago no longer occupied that position in the same way. She had not been lifted, not been rescued, she had chosen when to move, and that choice carried weight. Her eyes did not seek Daniel, did not acknowledge Vanessa, instead they rested briefly on the officer, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that did not need explanation. Vanessa took a step back now, the distance small but meaningful, her posture no longer perfectly aligned. her composure beginning to slip in ways too subtle to name but too clear to ignore. "I did not do anything," she said, but this time the words sounded less like a statement and more like a question she was asking herself, and the officer's response came with the same steady calm. "Ma'am, we have reviewed the footage," he said, and that word again, footage, landed heavier now, because it was no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, it was real, it existed, it had already been seen. Daniel's jaw tightened, his gaze moving through the room as if searching for control, for influence, for someone who would step forward and reshape the moment, but no one did, because the balance had shifted too far, too publicly, and influence does not move as easily when it is being watched. Somewhere in the background, a voice murmured, "It is already online." And though it was quiet, it carried, threading through the tension with undeniable weight, because online meant permanent, meant beyond reach, meant the story was no longer theirs to contain. Emily's hand rested gently against her stomach again, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, and as the officer took a step closer to Vanessa, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with quiet intention, the final pieces of the moment began to fall into place, not with noise, not with chaos, but with the kind of clarity that only comes when something has already been decided long before anyone realized it was happening. The shift became undeniable the moment Vanessa Blake stopped speaking, not because she had nothing left to say, but because for the first time that evening, her words no longer held weight in the room, and silence, real silence, settled in its place, thick and unyielding. The officer took another measured step forward, his posture unchanged, his voice steady. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you again to come with us." And this time, there was no attempt to soften the request, no effort to make it sound optional, it simply existed as a fact, as something that was already in motion. Vanessa's eyes flicked once more toward Daniel, searching, expecting, needing a response that would restore order, but Daniel did not move immediately, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second where he did nothing, spoke louder than anything he could have said. The room felt it, the subtle unraveling of certainty. The realization that the man who had once controlled every narrative in this space was now standing inside one he could not rewrite. "Daniel," Vanessa said quietly, her voice no longer smooth, no longer confident, but edged with something unfamiliar, something closer to urgency, and yet even then, he did not step in front of her, did not interrupt, did not assert the dominance that had defined him for years. Instead, his gaze moved outward, scanning the room, taking in the raised phones, the shifting expressions, the unmistakable awareness that this moment had already escaped the walls, that whatever happened next would not stay contained within polished marble and curated silence. A man near the back lowered his phone just slightly, whispering to the woman beside him, "It is everywhere now." And though his voice was low, the meaning carried, threading through the space with quiet certainty, because everyone understood what that meant. There was no pulling this back, no quiet resolution behind closed doors, no carefully managed statement that could erase what had already been seen. Emily Carter stood fully now, one hand resting lightly against the table for balance, the other still placed protectively over her stomach, her posture steady, composed, and as she lifted her chin just slightly, the contrast became impossible to ignore. She was no longer the woman on the floor, no longer the center of embarrassment. She had become something else entirely, something grounded, something unshaken in a way that did not need to prove itself. Her gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching, not pleading, simply observing, and when it passed over Daniel, there was no anger there, no visible accusation, only a quiet distance that felt final, as if whatever connection had once existed had already been severed long before this moment. The officer's hand gestured calmly toward the exit, a direction, not a force, and Vanessa hesitated, her body still. Her expression caught between disbelief and calculation, as if she were trying to find a version of this moment where she still held control, but that version no longer existed. "You cannot be serious," she said, but the words lacked conviction, and the officer's response remained unchanged. "We are," he said simply, and that simplicity carried more authority than anything else in the room. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower now, controlled but strained at the edges. "We will handle this with legal counsel. he said, but even as the words left him, they sounded delayed, out of step with what was already happening, and no one responded, because the moment had moved past negotiation, past influence, into something clearer, something defined by evidence and presence rather than status and perception. The faint reflection of flashing lights began to appear against the glass walls, subtle at first, then brighter. A reminder that the world outside had already begun to converge on what was unfolding inside, and as Vanessa took a slow step forward, not guided, not forced, but moving because there was no other direction left, the room watched, not with sympathy, not with shock, but with the quiet recognition that power, once exposed, does not disappear all at once, it fades piece by piece, until what remains is not control, but consequence, and Emily, standing still at the center of it all, did not need to say a single word to make that clear. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened again, slower this time, not with the quiet glide of an elevator but with the deliberate weight of something official arriving fully into view, and the reflection of red and blue lights outside the glass grew sharper, more defined, casting faint pulses across polished surfaces and perfectly arranged tables, turning what had once been a controlled, elegant environment into something exposed, something real. Vanessa Blake walked forward now, not confidently, not defiantly, but carefully, each step measured in a way that suggested she was still trying to understand how this moment had shifted so completely beyond her control, her posture no longer flawless, her expression no longer composed, and though she said nothing, the absence of her voice spoke louder than anything she had said before. Daniel Carter remained where he stood, his hands at his sides, his jaws set, watching as the situation unfolded without him, around him, past him. And for the first time, there was no immediate strategy, no quick adjustment, no smooth recalibration, only the realization that the narrative he had always controlled was now being written somewhere else, by someone else, in real time. A woman near the center of the room lowered her phone slightly and whispered, "It has already been shared thousands of times." And though the number was unclear, the implication was not. This was no longer a private moment, no longer a contained incident. It had become something larger, something that would continue to move long after the room emptied and the lights dimmed. Emily Carter stood quietly, her presence steady, her hands still resting over her stomach, and as she took a small step forward, not toward anyone in particular but simply into her own space, the movement carried a quiet authority, not loud, not demanding, but undeniable, because it was hers, entirely hers. Not given, not forced, not taken. One of the officers paused briefly beside her, his voice low, respectful. "Ma'am, do you need medical assistance?" he asked, and Emily gave a small shake of her head, her voice calm, even. "I am fine," she said again, but this time, the words did not sound like reassurance for others, they sounded like a declaration for herself, a boundary drawn in the middle of a moment that had tried to define her differently. Across the room, the guests had shifted from observers to witnesses, their attention no longer hesitant, their reactions no longer hidden, and in their eyes, in the subtle exchanges between them, there was a shared understanding forming, not just of what had happened, but of what it meant, because in a space built on appearances, the truth had just stepped in without permission. Vanessa reached the threshold of the exit and paused, just for a second, her gaze flicking back toward Daniel, searching for something, anything. But whatever she had expected to find was not there, and Daniel did not move, did not speak, did not follow, and that absence, that silence, was louder than any defense he could have offered. The officers guided her forward, not with force, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty, and as she disappeared beyond the doors, the shift completed itself, the balance that had once favored her now gone entirely, leaving behind only the echo of what had been and the weight of what would follow. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, not easily, because something had been revealed that could not be unseen, and as the faint sound of sirens lingered in the distance, blending with the low hum of the city below, Daniel finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that carried more tension than relief, his eyes moving once more across the room, but this time, no one looked away. No one pretended not to see, because whatever power had once shielded him had already begun to dissolve, and standing just a few feet away, Emily did not need to confront him, did not need to speak, because the distance between them had already said everything that mattered. The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, like something delicate being pulled apart thread by thread, and in the space Vanessa left behind, there was no immediate return to laughter, no quick recovery of the polished atmosphere that had defined the evening, only a lingering stillness that refused to be dismissed. Daniel Carter remained standing near the center of it all, but the space around him had changed. Subtly at first, then unmistakably, as guests who had once gravitated toward him now held their distance, their conversations quieter, their glances sharper, no longer seeking approval but forming judgment, and in a room built on perception, that shift carried more weight than any accusation spoken out loud. A man near the bar adjusted his tie, leaning toward another guest. "Did you see his face when they said video?" he whispered, and though the words were low, they carried, because in moments like this, every detail mattered, every expression, every pause, every flicker of uncertainty. Emily Carter took another small step forward, her movements steady, controlled, and as she reached for the back of a nearby chair, not to sit but simply to ground herself, the simple action drew attention in a way that felt different now, not out of concern, but out of recognition, because she was no longer the subject of embarrassment, she had become the center of something else entirely. Something quieter, stronger, something that did not need to demand attention to hold it. Daniel's eyes finally settled on her again, not with the dismissive distance from before, but with something harder to define, something caught between calculation and realization, as if he were trying to understand how the moment had shifted so completely, how the narrative he had dismissed minutes ago had turned into something he could not control. "Emily," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, but the name hung in the air without response. Because she did not turn toward him immediately, she did not rush to acknowledge him, and that absence, that pause, carried more weight than any confrontation could have. Across the room, phones continued to glow, screens reflecting the same scene. From different angles, and somewhere beyond the glass walls, beyond the city lights stretching for miles, the story continued to move, gaining momentum, gaining voices, gaining interpretations that no one inside the ballroom could shape anymore. A woman near the entrance exhaled softly. "This is not going away," she said, not to anyone in particular, but the truth of it settled over the room like a quiet certainty, because everyone understood what she meant, that this was no longer about a single moment, it was about what that moment revealed. Emily finally turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting Daniel's for the first time since she had stood up, and there was no anger there, no visible accusation, only a calm distance that felt complete, as if whatever needed to be said had already been decided long before either of them spoke, and in that look, something in Daniel's expression shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough to show that he understood, even if he did not want to. The faint sound of the elevator chimed again in the background, signaling movement, transition, the continuation of a night that no longer resembled what it had been planned to be. And as a member of the event staff quietly began clearing the broken arrangement of chairs, restoring the physical space piece by piece, it became clear that while the room could be reset, the moment itself could not. It had already left, already expanded, already taken on a life beyond this place. Emily's hand rested once more over her stomach, her posture steady, her presence calm, and without saying anything, without demanding anything, she simply stood there, and that was enough. Because in a room where power had once been defined by control, by status, by who could shape the narrative, the balance had shifted to something else entirely, something quieter, something rooted, something that did not need to prove itself to be undeniable. The distance between them settled into something permanent, not measured in feet or steps but in everything that had not been said, everything that no longer needed to be, and as the low hum of conversation slowly returned to the room, it carried a different tone now, sharper, more deliberate, shaped by the awareness that what had just happened could not be undone, only remembered. Daniel Carter adjusted his cuff slightly, a small, controlled movement that once would have gone unnoticed but now seemed almost performative under the quiet scrutiny surrounding him, and when he glanced around the ballroom, the familiar nods and subtle acknowledgments he had grown accustomed to were no longer there, replaced instead by careful distance, by eyes that met his and did not look away, not out of respect, but out of something closer to evaluation. Across the room, a screen lit up brighter than the others. Someone replaying the footage, the moment looping silently, Emily falling, Vanessa standing. Daniel laughing, and though no sound accompanied the image, the meaning was unmistakable. It did not need audio to carry its weight. A man near the window exhaled slowly, shaking his head just once. "He should have helped her," he said, and the simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any accusation, because it reduced everything to something basic, something human, something that had been missed in a room full of people who had seen it happen. Emily Carter stood quietly, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and as a member of the staff approached with a glass of water, she accepted it with a small nod, her fingers wrapping gently around it, grounding herself not in the room, not in the moment, but in something internal, something that did not shift with the opinions forming around her. Daniel took a step forward then, closing a fraction of the space between them, his voice lower, more controlled than before. "We should leave," he said, the words intended to sound decisive, to reassert direction, but they landed differently now, not as a command, not as a solution, but as a suggestion that no longer held authority. Emily did not move immediately, did not respond right away, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying no strain, no urgency. "You can leave," she said, and the distinction in those words was clear, simple, and final. Something in Daniel's expression shifted again, a tightening, a flicker of something he did not name, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might respond, might push back, might try to reclaim something of what had been lost, but the room was still watching, still recording, still holding every second in place, and whatever he might have said remained unspoken. Near the entrance, the doors opened once more. Not for authority this time, but for movement guests. Beginning to leave in quiet clusters, their conversations low but constant, carrying pieces of the story with them, fragments that would continue to spread, to grow, to shape how this night would be remembered far beyond the walls of the ballroom. Emily set the glass down gently on the table beside her, her hand returning to rest over her stomach, and as she turned slightly toward the exit, not following Daniel, not waiting for him, but choosing her own direction, the shift completed itself. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper than anything spoken. Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, alone in a space that had once revolved around him, his gaze following her, but not calling her back, not reaching out, because something fundamental had already changed, something that could not be negotiated or repaired in a single moment. And as the lights of the city flickered beyond the glass, reflecting a world that had already begun to move on, it became clear that what remained in the room was not power, not control, but consequence, and Emily, walking steadily toward the doors, carried none of it with her. The doors did not make a sound when Emily Carter stepped through them, but the shift they marked was unmistakable, the transition from a room filled with controlled appearances to a space where nothing needed to be performed, and as the cool air of the hallway met her, it carried with it a quiet clarity that had been missing inside. The soft echo of her footsteps against polished tile replaced the hum of voices behind her, each step measured. Steady, not hurried, not hesitant, just forward and... For the first time that evening, there was no audience, no watching eyes, no silent judgments shaping the moment, only distance, growing with every second she chose not to look back. Inside the ballroom, Daniel Carter remained where he was, the space around him continuing to thin as guests filtered out, conversations drifting away from him rather than toward him, and though no one confronted him directly, the absence of engagement spoke louder than any accusation, because in rooms like that, silence is not neutral, it is selective. A man who had once waited for Daniel's approval now turned his shoulder slightly, choosing instead to follow a different conversation, and that small movement, almost imperceptible, carried the weight of a decision, the kind that reshapes dynamics without a single word being spoken. Near the bar, two women exchanged a glance, one of them lowering her phone after watching the footage again, her voice quiet but certain. "It is already trending," she said, and though the exact numbers were unknown, the implication settled heavily. because trending meant attention, and attention meant the story was no longer contained within context. It would be interpreted, repeated, amplified. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand resting briefly against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something familiar, but the surface beneath his fingers offered no control, no reassurance, only the cold reality of a moment that had moved beyond him. In the hallway, Emily paused near the elevator, her reflection faintly visible in the brushed steel doors, and for a brief second she studied it, not critically, not emotionally, simply observing, as if confirming something internal rather than external. And when the elevator chimed and the doors opened, she stepped inside without hesitation. The mirrored walls reflected her from multiple angles, but none of them altered the calm steadiness in her expression, none of them distorted the quiet strength in the way she stood, her hand still resting lightly over her stomach. A gesture that had remained constant through everything, grounding, protective, unshaken. Back in the ballroom, Daniel finally moved, not toward the exit, not after Emily, but toward the center of the room, as if reclaiming physical space might restore something intangible. But the gesture fell short, because space without presence is just distance, and presence cannot be demanded once it has shifted. A staff member passed by, clearing a table that had been left untouched, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Not with recognition, not with deference, but with neutrality, and that neutrality in a space where he had once commanded attention, felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. The elevator doors closed softly, sealing Emily into a space that moved downward, away from the height, away from the spectacle, away from the moment that had tried to define her. And as the numbers above the panel began to descend, each floor marking a quiet separation, it became clear that what she carried with her was not the fall, not the silence that followed, not even the watching eyes, but something else entirely. Something that had been there long before the chair tipped, long before the room shifted, something that did not need validation to exist, and would not be diminished by anything left behind. The elevator descended in silence, each passing floor marked by a soft chime that felt less like movement and more like separation, as if with every number that lit up above the panel, Emily Carter was placing another layer of distance between herself and everything that had just unfolded, and yet nothing about her expression suggested escape. There was no urgency, no relief, only a quiet steadiness that remained unchanged. The mirrored walls reflected her from every angle, but there was no distortion in what she saw, no hesitation in the way she held herself, one hand resting gently over her stomach, the other relaxed at her side, her posture aligned not with the expectations of a room left behind, but with something internal, something that had already been decided long before the moment demanded it. When the elevator doors opened into the lobby, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The polished calm of a space designed for arrival and departure replacing the tension that had filled the upper floors, and a concierge behind the desk glanced up briefly, his expression neutral, unaware, untouched by the story that had already begun to spread above him, because here, for now, the world had not caught up yet. Emily stepped forward, her pace unbroken, her gaze steady, and as she crossed the marble floor toward the entrance, the glass doors ahead reflected the city beyond, lights stretching into the distance. Cars moving in quiet streams, a world continuing exactly as it had before, unchanged, indifferent, vast. Behind her, far above, the ballroom continued to empty, the last fragments of conversation trailing off as guests departed in small groups, carrying with them pieces of the night, interpretations already forming, conclusions already taking shape, and at the center of what remained, Daniel Carter stood alone, the space around him no longer filled with admiration or attention, but with absence, the kind that settles slowly, leaving no immediate impact, only a growing awareness of what is no longer there. He moved toward the window then, his reflection faint against the glass, the city lights stretching behind it, and for a moment he simply stood there, looking out, not at anything specific, not at any one point, but at the distance itself, as if trying to measure something that could not be quantified, and in the reflection, the outline of his figure appeared smaller, less defined than it had been earlier in the night. A staff member passed behind him, clearing the final table, resetting the room piece by piece, restoring its physical order, but the atmosphere remained altered, Because what had shifted could not be arranged back into place, it existed now in memory, in recording, in every device that had captured it. Outside, the glass doors opened automatically as Emily approached, a soft mechanical sound that marked her transition from inside to out, and as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the air cooler, the sounds of the city clearer, she paused just briefly, not to look back, not to reconsider, but simply to stand, to breathe, to exist in a space that required nothing from her. A car passed by. Headlights sweeping across the pavement, and for a moment, the light caught her reflection in the glass behind her, a fleeting image that did not linger, that did not demand attention, and then it was gone, replaced by movement, by continuation. Far above, the last lights in the ballroom began to dim, one by one, the event coming to a close not with celebration, not with applause, but with a quiet ending that carried more weight than anything that had preceded it, and in that contrast between what had been planned and what had actually occurred, the truth of the night settled fully into place, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, because some moments do not need to be announced to be remembered, they simply happen, and then they remain. The city did not pause for what had happened above it. Traffic continued to move in steady lines, headlights stretching into long reflections across wet pavement, voices carried on the night air in fragments that had nothing to do with what had just unfolded, and yet somewhere within that constant motion, the story had already begun to travel, not loudly, not all at once, but in quiet bursts of attention spreading across screens and conversations. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the sidewalk for a moment longer, her posture unchanged, her breathing even. And as she reached into her bag to retrieve her phone, the screen lit up before she even touched it. Notifications, stacking one over another, messages, missed calls, alerts that all pointed to the same thing. The moment had already moved beyond her. It was no longer contained, no longer private, no longer something that could be minimized or reinterpreted. She did not open them immediately, did not scroll, did not react. Instead, she held the phone in her hand for a second, as if acknowledging its presence without allowing it to define her next step, and then she slipped it back into her bag, choosing silence over noise, control over reaction. Across the street, a car slowed briefly, then continued, the driver unaware of who stood just a few feet away, unaware of the moment that had already begun to reshape conversations in places far removed from this quiet stretch of pavement, because the world does not stop for individual stories, it absorbs them, redistributes them, and moves on, far above. In the building she had just left, the final guests stepped into elevators, their conversations no longer hushed, their voices carrying a mix of disbelief and certainty, each version of the story slightly different, slightly adjusted, but all anchored to the same undeniable image that had been captured and shared, replayed and examined from angles that left little room for interpretation. Daniel Carter remained inside, no longer at the center, no longer surrounded, his presence reduced not by force, but by the absence of attention, and as he finally reached for his phone, the screen mirrored what Emily had already seen: notifications, messages, the rapid spread of something he could not contain, and for a brief second, his reflection appeared on the dark surface of the screen, layered over the incoming flood of information, a contrast between who he had been in that room and what the world was beginning to see. He did not respond immediately, did not call, did not type, because whatever response he could offer would arrive after the moment had already defined itself, after the narrative had already taken shape without him. Outside, Emily began to walk, her steps steady, unhurried, moving along the sidewalk with a direction that did not need to be explained, and as she passed beneath the soft glow of streetlights, her shadow stretched briefly behind her, then shifted, then disappeared as she moved forward. Never lingering, never pulling her back, a passing bus slowed at the corner, its windows reflecting fragments of the city, and for a moment, her image appeared in the glass, layered over the movement of lights and shapes, a fleeting reflection that existed only as long as she stood within it, and then it was gone, replaced by something else, something new, somewhere across the city, in apartments, in offices, in places where people gathered around glowing screens. The same moment continued to play, the same sequence repeating, analyzed, shared, reacted to, each replay adding another layer of permanence, because once something is seen enough times, it becomes fixed, not just as an event, but as a narrative. Emily did not look back, did not pause again, because whatever remained behind her no longer required her presence to exist. It would continue on its own, shaped by voices she would never hear, interpretations she would never control. And as she moved further into the night, the distance between who she had been in that room and who she was now became clear, not defined by what had happened, but by what she chose to carry forward, and more importantly, what she chose to leave behind. The night carried on the way it always did, indifferent, expansive, untouched by the weight of any single moment, and yet within that vast movement, certain stories found a way to settle, to anchor themselves in memory long after the noise around them faded. And as Emily Carter continued down the sidewalk, her pace steady, her gaze forward, it became clear that what had happened behind her was no longer something she needed to carry. It had already taken its own path. The city lights reflected softly in the windows she passed, brief fragments of her image appearing and disappearing as she moved, never lingering, never holding her in place. And there was something quiet in that rhythm, something final, as if each step confirmed a decision that had already been made, not in reaction, not in impulse, but in certainty. Somewhere across town, screens still glowed with the same captured moment, the same sequence replayed again and again, analyzed, discussed, reshaped into headlines and opinions, and in those retellings, details would shift, perspectives would change, but the core of it, the truth of what had been seen, would remain. Because some images do not need explanation, they speak for themselves. In the building she had left behind, the last lights in the ballroom dimmed completely, the space returned to stillness, tables reset, chairs aligned, every physical trace of the evening carefully erased, and yet the absence felt heavier than the presence had been, because what mattered had already moved beyond those walls, beyond that room, into something that could not be rearranged or forgotten. Daniel Carter stood alone for a moment longer before finally turning away from the window, his reflection fading as he moved, the city lights no longer framing him the way they had earlier in the night, and as he walked toward the exit, there was no audience left, no one to observe, no one to respond, only the quiet echo of his own footsteps in a space that no longer belonged to him in the same way. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, clearer, and as Emily reached the corner, she paused just briefly, not to look back, not to reconsider, but simply to exist in the moment as it was, unshaped by what had come before it. And when the light changed, she stepped forward, crossing into the flow of this city without hesitation, without announcement, her presence blending into the movement around her, not lost, but no longer defined by a single event. A car passed, then another, the rhythm of the street continuing uninterrupted, and in that continuity, there was something grounding. Something that reminded her that the world did not revolve around any one moment, no matter how loud it seemed at the time. Far away, in places she would never see, people would continue to watch, to comment, to decide what they believed, but none of that reached her now, none of it altered the quiet steadiness in the way she moved forward, because the most important part of the story had already been decided, not by what happened to her, but by how she chose to leave it behind. And as the night stretched on, carrying everything with it, the truth settled into something simple, something unspoken, something that did not need to be repeated to be understood, that some men stand in rooms full of power and still lose everything that matters, and some women walk away in silence and take all of their dignity with them.